It was a bright sunny morning when I, Amina, had the most exciting day of my life planned. As a successful businesswoman, I had achieved so much, but this particular trip was going to mark the beginning of something even bigger. I had been given the privilege of flying in my very own private jet, a dream that had seemed so far out of reach just a few years ago. But there I was, holding the keys to this new chapter in my life with everything going perfectly, until it wasn't. I approached the private terminal, the excitement building up inside me. The sleek jet gleamed in the sunlight, promising comfort and luxury. I was ready to leave the chaos of the city behind and head to a serene destination, one where I could finally unwind. But as I walked up to the tarmac, a man in a crisp uniform stepped forward. He wasn't smiling. I took it as a sign of professionalism, thinking maybe he was just doing his job. "Excuse me, miss, but I'm afraid I can't let you board," he said, his voice cold and stern. My heart skipped a beat. Was he serious? "Sorry, what do you mean?" "I'm the owner of this jet," I replied, confused but calm, trying to understand what was happening. The man looked me up and down, almost dismissively, and said, "No, ma'am. You need to step aside. This jet isn't for you. There must be some mistake." I stood there, stunned. My mind raced. Was this a joke? Did he think I was a passenger, or worse, someone who didn't belong here? "I am the owner. You can check the booking if you want," I said, trying to remain composed. His eyes narrowed, and there was a slight pause as he glanced at the clipboard in his hands. "I don't think you understand, miss." I said no. He repeated firmly, almost mockingly. "You need to leave now." I felt my blood run cold. The man was talking to me like I didn't have the right to even set foot on the jet. My stomach twisted with a mix of frustration and confusion. What did he mean by no? Was it because of the color of my skin? Did he assume I was an imposter, someone who couldn't possibly own something like this? I tried to stay calm. "Please just check the system again. I have all the necessary documents right here," I said, reaching for my phone, but he stepped back and held up a hand. "I've made my decision," he said, his voice still devoid of any warmth. Something inside me snapped. I wasn't just going to walk away, not without understanding why this was happening. I knew that sometimes people in positions of power, people who thought they were above others, would do anything to belittle or degrade those they deemed unworthy. And I wasn't going to let him do that to me. "Are you refusing me because I'm black?" I asked, my voice steady but full of emotion. The question hung in the air between us, raw and undeniable. It wasn't the kind of thing anyone should have to ask, but it felt like the only explanation for what was happening. He froze. For a brief moment, I saw a flicker of discomfort in his eyes, but he quickly masked it with a dismissive glance. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his words falling flat. "You're wrong," I said, shaking my head slowly. "You can't judge me like this. I am who I am, and I have the right to be here just like anyone else." The silence between us stretched out. My heart pounded and I could feel my legs beginning to shake, but I stood firm. I was not going to let this moment define me in a way that made me feel small. I had worked too hard, fought too many battles, and come too far to let some ignorant man rob me of the success I had earned. I felt a tap on my shoulder, and I turned to find the airport manager standing there. His presence was calm but commanding. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, glancing between me and the pilot. The pilot immediately straightened up as though he had been caught doing something wrong. He cleared his throat and muttered, "There's been a mistake." "A mistake?" The manager raised an eyebrow. "Amina is the owner of this jet. I've confirmed it myself. So, I suggest you apologize and let her on board immediately." The pilot's face turned pale, his eyes widening as he processed the manager's words. He clearly hadn't expected this. "I am sorry," the pilot stammered, his arrogance now replaced with nervousness. "I didn't know she was the owner." The manager didn't seem satisfied with his apology. "Well, now you know," he said sharply. "And I suggest you remember that in the future." But the damage had already been done. The humiliation, the unfairness of it all, it stung. I could feel my face flush with anger, but I swallowed it down. I wasn't going to let him win by showing him my pain. "I've worked my whole life for this," I said quietly, more to myself than to him. "And I won't let you or anyone else take that away from me." The pilot opened his mouth, perhaps to say something else, but then he seemed to think better of it. He just stood there silent. I took a deep breath and turned to the manager. "Thank you," I said, my voice much softer now. "I appreciate your help." He nodded. "No problem. Just make sure this doesn't happen again." I finally walked toward the jet, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened pressing on my shoulders. I didn't look back at the pilot. I didn't need to. I knew the truth about myself. I knew my worth. As I boarded the jet, my emotions were a whirlwind. I had faced discrimination, yes, but I had also faced it and stood tall. I had proven something not just to that pilot but to myself. I had fought for my place in the world, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. The door closed behind me and I sat down in the plush seat, finally allowing myself to breathe. But just as I started to relax, the sound of the cockpit door opening interrupted my thoughts. The manager stepped inside, a grave look on his face. "I need to speak with you for a moment," he said. I nodded, my heart suddenly racing again. What could this be about now? "You've probably already figured it out," the manager began, "but the pilot, he's been fired." My eyes widened. What? Why? Because of his behavior toward you. We can't tolerate discrimination in any form here, and what he did was unacceptable. He made an assumption based on your appearance, and that's something we don't stand for. I was taken aback. Part of me felt a sense of relief. He wouldn't be able to hurt anyone else with his prejudice. But another part of me couldn't help but feel sorry for him. He had let his biases take over, and now he had to face the consequences. "Thank you," I said softly. "I appreciate that." He gave me a nod before stepping out. I sat there for a moment, letting the reality of the situation sink in. The truth was, no matter how far I'd come, I would always have to face moments like this. People who judged me assumed I wasn't worthy just because of the color of my skin. But I wasn't going to let them win. As the jet took off, I watched the world shrink beneath me. And for the first time that day, I felt a sense of peace. I knew that no matter what happened, I would continue to rise above the hate, the ignorance, and the bias. Because I was Amina, and no one could take that from me. The jet soared into the clear sky, its powerful engines humming smoothly as we ascended higher, leaving the chaos of the city below. But as I gazed out the window, my thoughts were a turbulent mix of emotions: anger, confusion, disbelief, and even a strange sense of relief. How could someone be so quick to judge me, so quick to assume I didn't belong? I closed my eyes, trying to calm my racing mind, but the image of the pilot's face, his smugness, his arrogance, kept flashing in my mind. It felt like a personal attack, not just on me but on everything I had worked for. In a world that was still so divided, the weight of prejudice and bias was a daily reality, and I had faced it all my life. But this had felt different. It wasn't just an encounter with racism. It was an attack on my identity, on my success, on my place in this world. I took a deep breath and looked out the window again, trying to shake off the feelings of frustration and anger that had settled in my chest. As the jet ascended higher, the view became even more breathtaking. The sprawling city below seemed so small now, and it was almost as if the distance between me and the world had grown. But even in that vastness, I could still feel the sting of the pilot's actions. Just as I was beginning to gather my thoughts, a voice came over the intercom, breaking the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are currently cruising at an altitude of 35,000 feet, and we expect a smooth flight ahead. Please sit back and relax as we make our way to your destination. We will keep you informed of any updates as necessary." I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes again, trying to push the events of the morning out of my mind. But no matter how much I tried to relax, the tension in my body wouldn't dissipate. My fingers drummed nervously on the armrest, and the unease in my stomach lingered. The truth was, I was still shaken. That pilot's refusal to let me board had been a cruel reminder of the prejudices that people like him could harbor. But as the flight continued, I began to reflect on the bigger picture. I had fought for everything I had achieved. Nothing had been handed to me. I had spent years building my career, navigating obstacles, and proving my worth to a world that often underestimated me because of the color of my skin. I had worked my way up from nothing, and now I had my own private jet. No one could take that away from me, not him, not anyone. As I sat there, lost in my thoughts, I felt a strange shift in the air. The hum of the jet's engine seemed to grow louder, and the plane began to shake slightly. I opened my eyes, gripping the armrests tighter as the turbulence intensified. The sound of the engines grew louder still, and I could feel a strange unease creeping into my bones. A few seconds later, the intercom crackled again, and this time the captain's voice was tinged with urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered some unexpected turbulence. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain seated with your seatbelts securely fastened until further notice." My heart skipped a beat. I glanced around the cabin, but everything seemed calm. Passengers were still sitting in their seats, some reading books, others with their eyes closed, seemingly unaware of the sudden shift in the plane's movement. But I could feel it, a strange, unsettling energy in the air, a heaviness that seemed to hang over the cabin. Suddenly the plane jolted again, this time much harder. The overhead compartments rattled and several passengers gasped. My stomach dropped as the plane dipped sharply, throwing me against my seatbelt. I gripped the armrest tightly, my heart pounding in my chest. "Please remain calm," the captain's voice crackled over the intercom again, but there was an edge to his words now. "We are encountering some technical difficulties. We are doing everything we can to regain control of the aircraft. Please remain seated." The plane rocked again, this time even more violently. I felt a wave of panic wash over me, and my breath came in shallow gasps. This wasn't normal turbulence. Something was wrong. I glanced at the flight attendants, who were now scrambling to secure the cabin. I could see the fear in their eyes, and it only made my own fear grow stronger. I looked out the window, trying to keep my composure. The sky had darkened, clouds rolling in fast. What had started as a sunny morning had turned into something much more ominous. I closed my eyes, gripping the armrest even harder, as if holding on could somehow keep me safe. The plane jerked again, and this time the feeling of free fall was undeniable. My stomach lurched and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I was no longer thinking rationally. My mind was spinning, my thoughts jumbled. Was I going to die? Was this the end? Suddenly the intercom crackled once more, but this time it was different. It wasn't the captain's voice I heard. It was a woman's voice, calm and steady but with an unmistakable sense of urgency. "This is the chief flight attendant," she said. "We are encountering a serious situation. We are attempting an emergency landing, and we need everyone to remain calm and follow all instructions carefully. Please brace yourselves for a possible rough landing." The word, emergency, sent a jolt of fear through my body. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. I had no idea what was happening, but it felt like the world was closing in on me. I tried to steady my breath, to think logically, but the fear was overwhelming. The turbulence worsened, and the plane seemed to plummet downward as though we were falling from the sky. I could hear the cries of other passengers around me, some of them clutching the armrests, others whispering prayers under their breath. I wanted to scream, to ask what was going on, but I couldn't find my voice. Suddenly the plane dipped again, and I felt the intense pressure on my chest as if I was being crushed by the weight of the world. I gritted my teeth and squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the worst. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the plane stopped jerking. The turbulence ceased, and for a moment, everything went eerily still. The silence was almost deafening. I opened my eyes, unsure of what to expect, and saw the flight attendants moving quickly down the aisle, preparing for the emergency landing. I could hear the captain's voice again, more urgent now. "We are attempting to land at the nearest airport. Please stay calm and remain seated until further instructions." I couldn't believe what was happening. The relief of the turbulence stopping was short-lived as the fear of what might happen next crept back into my mind. We were in the middle of nowhere, and it was clear that something had gone terribly wrong. But what? Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as we descended. I could hear the roaring of the engines, the screeching of metal as the plane descended, and the muffled voices of the flight attendants reassuring passengers. The tension in the cabin was unbearable. The plane began to shake again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't the chaotic turbulence we had experienced before. This was a controlled descent. We were coming in for an emergency landing, and I could feel the nose of the jet tilting downward. Suddenly everything went black. The world seemed to disappear, and for a brief moment, there was nothing but an overwhelming sense of weightlessness. And then crash. The plane hit the ground with a bone-rattling jolt, and everything went sideways. The cabin lurched violently, and I was thrown against my seatbelt. There was a deafening screeching sound, followed by a series of loud, terrifying thuds. I could feel the plane skidding across the ground, the tires screeching as they fought for traction. The smell of burning rubber filled the air, and the sound of metal grinding against concrete was enough to make my ears ring. I could hear the passengers screaming, their voices a blend of terror and confusion. The jet came to a sudden, jarring stop. Silence. My heart was still racing in my chest, but the moment of chaos was over. I was alive. We were alive. But where were we? What had just happened? And what was going to happen next? The emergency exits opened, and the flight attendants quickly began ushering passengers out of the plane. I stumbled to my feet, my legs unsteady, my mind still reeling from the crash. I grabbed my belongings and made my way toward the door, my hands trembling. Outside, I was greeted by flashing lights and the frantic movement of rescue teams. The plane had skidded to a halt on the runway, but it was clear that we had narrowly avoided a far worse fate. But as I stood there, trying to process everything that had just happened, I couldn't help but wonder, Was this just a tragic accident, or was there something more to it? And who was to blame? The pilot? The crew? Or was this something more sinister, something that connected to the reason why he had tried to stop me from boarding in the first place? The questions swirled in my mind, unanswered and unsettling. But one thing was clear: my life would never be the same again. The air felt colder as I walked away from the pilot, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion, anger, and determination. The wreckage of the plane was behind me, but my mind kept racing back to it, replaying the moments before the crash. The pilot's words echoed in my ears, but there was something about his demeanor that unsettled me. His apology had felt too easy, too rehearsed. A part of me wanted to believe him, but another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Much more. I pushed the thought aside, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. There was no time to waste. The wreckage, the emergency teams, the chaos, it was all just a distraction from the truth I was determined to uncover. But where to start? How could I even begin to piece together what had happened? I reached the makeshift command center where emergency responders were taking charge of the aftermath. The officers and medics were scrambling to process everything, their movements quick but purposeful. Yet there was an air of confusion, like no one quite knew what had just unfolded. No one seemed to have answers. I approached one of the officers, a woman in her mid-30s wearing a dark blue uniform. She was speaking to a group of responders, but when she noticed me, her gaze shifted to something far less warm. "Excuse me," I said, trying to steady my breath. "I need to know what happened. What caused the crash? Was it mechanical failure? Or something else?" She hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking nervously toward the wreckage, then back to me. "It's too soon to say," she replied with a tight smile. "We're still trying to gather information. There are a lot of moving parts here and everything's still in chaos." "I understand," I said, pressing on. "But I need to know. Something doesn't add up. The way the plane dropped, it felt wrong. It didn't feel like ordinary turbulence." She looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "I don't have answers right now," she said, her voice clipped. "But I'll keep you updated as soon as we have more information. Right now, it's about getting the survivors treated and securing the area." I nodded, disappointed but not deterred. There was no way I could just wait. The more I stood around, the more I felt like the pieces of the puzzle were slipping through my fingers. I had to act. As I turned to leave, I spotted something in the distance that caught my eye. A small group of officers was gathered around the plane's wreckage, huddled closely together, as if discussing something intensely. There was an unspoken energy in the air that intrigued me. Something was happening, and it felt like a crucial piece of the puzzle was hidden there. Without a second thought, I moved closer, keeping my distance to avoid being seen. The officers were too engrossed in their conversation to notice me as I edged closer. I crouched behind a nearby debris pile, straining to hear their conversation. The wind howled through the wreckage, but I could make out fragments of their words. "Strange, feels off, something was tampered with." I leaned in closer, heart pounding in my chest. Tampered with? What did that mean? Was someone involved in the crash, or had there been foul play? "Do you think it could be sabotage?" one officer asked, his voice low and urgent. The response was drowned out by a burst of static from a nearby radio, but my heart skipped a beat. Sabotage? Was it possible? Was someone trying to bring down the plane intentionally? The questions flooded my mind, each one more terrifying than the last. Suddenly, a loud voice broke through the tension, causing me to jump. What the hell's going on here? It was the same officer who had dismissed me earlier, and her voice was filled with alarm. The group quickly scattered, leaving me in the dust, unsure of what I had just heard. The officer who had spoken to me earlier rushed forward, her face a mask of professionalism. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her eyes narrowing. I was just trying to understand what's going on," I stammered, trying to hide my nerves. "I overheard something. Something about sabotage. What does that mean?" The officer's eyes flickered, and I could see the calculation behind her gaze. For a moment, it seemed like she was debating whether to tell me anything. Then, as if making a decision, she sighed and motioned for me to follow her. "Come with me," she said curtly. I followed her reluctantly, my pulse quickening. Sabotage? Could this really be happening? Was the crash part of some larger scheme? She led me to a quieter area, away from the chaos of the command center. The air was thick with tension, and the weight of the conversation felt heavy. I stood silently as she took a deep breath and met my gaze. "There's something you should know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's an ongoing investigation into the incident. We've got reason to believe that there may have been some external interference. Something Intentional. My stomach dropped. External interference? Intentional? My mind reeled as the implications settled in. This wasn't just a mechanical failure or a freak accident. Someone had wanted this to happen. Are you saying someone sabotaged the plane? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. She nodded grimly. It's too early to make definitive conclusions, but we're looking into it. We've found evidence that suggests something wasn't right with the flight systems. It could have been tampered with before takeoff. I swallowed hard, trying to process what she was telling me. A plane crash wasn't something you just brushed off as an accident. It wasn't something you just walked away from. Someone had tried to take control of the situation. And the pilot? Had he been involved? The officer looked around, her eyes scanning the area to ensure no one was listening. We've already informed the higher-ups. But you should know the pilot, he's under investigation. His behavior has raised some serious red flags. My heart stopped. The pilot? Was he somehow involved in all of this? Had he been part of whatever sabotage had taken place? I need to know everything, I said, my voice firm. How can I help? I have to know what happened. The officer hesitated, then glanced around again. You're not supposed to be involved in this, she said quietly. But, if you want to know the truth, there's someone you should talk to. Someone who might have answers. She handed me a small, folded piece of paper, and for a moment I thought it might be a clue or a name. Go to the airport's back office, she instructed. There's a technician named Mark. He knows about the flight systems. He might have information you need. I nodded, tucking the paper into my pocket. The weight of the situation was sinking in, but there was no turning back now. I had to find the truth. The sabotage, the pilot, everything, it was all part of something bigger than I could have ever imagined. As I walked away from the officer, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, but no one was there. Yet the sensation lingered. Someone didn't want me digging into this any further. Whoever was behind this, they had their eyes on me. I made my way through the wreckage, my thoughts consumed by the mystery unfolding before me. I couldn't help but wonder, who could be behind this? Why would someone want to sabotage a plane? And was the pilot just an innocent pawn, or was he more involved than he let on? I reached the back office of the airport, a nondescript building tucked away from the main terminal. The door was locked, but I could see a small window near the entrance. I knocked twice, then waited, my heart racing. A few moments passed before the door opened, revealing a man in his mid-40s, dressed in a maintenance uniform. His face was lined with worry, but there was something about him that struck me as trustworthy. Mark? I asked, my voice steady despite the storm of thoughts in my head. He nodded, his eyes flicking to the paper I had taken from the officer. You're the one asking about the crash, he said quietly. Come inside. We need to talk. And with that, I stepped inside the office, the door closing softly behind me. I was closer than ever to the truth. But what I didn't know was just how deep this conspiracy ran, and how much danger I was in now that I had crossed the line.